All right, hi guys. You should have your assignment open, and I think there's 12 questions. So I'm going to be kind of walking you through this PowerPoint or these slides, and then um, after we're done, you should be able to answer all these questions. The questions do go in order. So we're going to talk about the second KKK or the KKK of the 1920s. So this is different than the Ku Klux Klan we've already learned about. So the first Ku Klux Klan was created right after the Civil War ended. This is during like the Reconstruction period in the South. So it was set up mainly by former Confederate soldiers in the South who didn't really want the North coming in and reconstructing the South. They might have wanted the money, but they didn't want all these new policies and like these new amendments that were going to try to force these white racist people to give African Americans equal rights. And so um, they, again, like I kind of just emphasized, they were opposed to those recently freed slaves, those freedmen. They didn't want them to be able to vote. They didn't want Northerners coming into the South. Some Northerners also came into the South because they saw an easy way to make money because they, had money. They weren't devastated by the Civil War and they could start up a new business. And there were a lot of Northerners that moved down there just to kind of strike it rich off of the South's downfalling. Um, During this first Ku Klux Klan, there was hundreds of African Americans who were murdered. Lots of black churches and schools were attacked or burned. Um, and so that's kind of the Ku Klux Klan we've already talked about a little bit. But then after Reconstruction ends, and remember the Rutherford B. Hayes, he becomes president. He probably shouldn't have become president. And basically, to pacify the South, they say, well, we'll remove the army from the we'll remove the army from the north or from the south, I mean. And so as of like 1876, that's kind of when this first KKK ends because the South goes back to like Jim Crow laws and being ridiculous and very racist against African Americans. So it kind of dies off. Then why do we see this like reemergence and popularity of the KKK again, specifically in the 1920s? There's two main events that we can kind of say that led to it gaining popularity again. So this was started around 1915 and was very popular. The Ku Klux Klan was very popular through the 1920s. So these two events are this book and movie called The Birth of a Nation and the death of this little girl named Mary Phagan. So I'll explain both of those. Okay. So the first, it was actually a book called The Klansman, and then when they made this book into a movie, it was sometimes called The Klansman, sometimes called Birth of a Nation. So in this book slash movie, it's about two families right after the Civil. Well, actually, it follows from before the Civil War, through the Civil War, and then after the Civil War. So it follows two families, the Stonemans from the north and the Camerons from the south. And these families like live right on the border between northern and southern states. And so like they know each other. And so suddenly when the war happens and is over now and the South is lost, the Camerons find that like their way of life in the South is basically in ruins, and they're frustrated that the Northern Army comes down and supposedly, like in the book, not necessarily like this is true, in the book, the North brings in the army, which is true, right? The North did after the Civil War. They kept the army in the South to basically enforce that they would give African Americans rights and stuff. But in the book, supposedly the Northern Army brought in like black militias, meaning black groups of soldiers, and supposedly, like in the book, these black soldiers were attempting to rape the white women. Now that's not necessarily true, but that's what the book was saying. Now, in specifically what happens in the book is that Flora Cameron, she's one of the kids of this Cameron family in the South. She's approached by this black soldier named Gus, and Gus proposes and wants to get married to her. She runs away and is like freaked out by this, and Gus follows her, and then either like in the movie, it's not really clear, and I can't remember what it says in the book, but she either jumps or falls off a cliff and dies. So it's not Gus's fault. But Gus is then found by these white Southern men who are like there to get revenge and protect Flora, who's just died because of this, and Gus is then lynched or hung. And so basically in the book, the Reconstructionists, the people from the North that are trying to enforce Reconstruction, they're driven out of the South, and basically these people who lynched Gus, the Klan or whatever, restores like Southern white rights and restores their prosperity. And the key here is that like they're seen in both the book and the movie, the Ku Klux Klan are seen as the heroes of the story. So like if you guys have ever watched a movie where it's like you're rooting for the gangster or the mob because that's how the movie wants you to do it, like you root for the bad guys even though you know they're the bad guys. This is kind of what this book and movie is doing, right? We know the Ku Klux Klan are the bad guys, but at the time they're not really seen as necessarily horrible in the South, and like they're being portrayed in the book and the movie as the heroes of the story. So there's a lot of people, not just in the South, but also like prejudiced people and racist people in the North who are, freaked out by all the changes happening in the 1920s. And so this film does draw support from a lot of different places. A quote by the president says, "The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation, until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire in the South, to protect the Southern country." So Woodrow Wilson, what he's saying here is that basically from this book and movie that happens way after Reconstruction times, men just been reading this feel like, oh my gosh, like I got to protect our white women from these bad black people, and the Ku Klux Klan is like the hero of the story. And so it's not like it's really like anyone's in danger from black army, officers or soldiers, but the idea is it gives men an idea now from this book and movie, and so it starts to gain popularity. One of the events is this movie coming out. Here's a picture from the movie of the Klan, right? It's portraying the Klan as like the saviors, the good people, capturing this evil guy who's tried to hurt their precious little young Flora. Okay, remember this is all a fictional story. It's not true. Yet people are still going to join the KKK because of it. Now, the second event is the murder of this girl named Mary Fagan. So she was 13 and she worked in a pencil factory in Atlanta, Georgia. And after her body was found in the pencil factory, there was three main suspects for her murder. Newt Lee, he was like a night guard or night watchman. He was black. I'll explain why this is important in a second, his ethnicity. Jim Conley was kind of like a janitor, and he was seen washing blood from his shirt actually right after the incident. So he obviously would be one of the main contenders or suspects. And the third suspect is Leo Frank. He was a factory superintendent, kind of like the factory manager. And supposedly blood and hairs from the victim were found near his office because there was like red splotches on the wall near his office. So these are the three people that are going to maybe go to trial or arrest. They're all arrested for her murder. Now, some clarification. When she died, there were some other issues going on in the area. So there was definitely racial tension because it was the South. And it wasn't just racial tension against black people, it was also against like Jewish people. And there was a lot of pushback among the poor white people in the South against three groups. Northerners, like people who had come from the North and were striking it rich in the South, and basically a lot of people in the South are still like in poverty. There was a lot of pushback also in the South against this factory system, right, where they felt like factory owners gained a lot of money off the backs of, little kids and poor people who are making hardly anything. And there was also a lot of pushback against Jews. Now, Leo Frank, he was from the North originally. He had married someone from the South and obviously lived in the South, but originally he was from the North, and he was a Jew by ethnicity. And so kind of on two accounts, he's seen as a bad guy. Also, though, if you look, right, at the bottom here, talks about how there was a lot of resistance against the factory system. Well, Leo Frank is like the leader of this factory. He's a manager. He's making probably pretty good money versus like someone like Mary Fagan who worked there. She's making very little, and she's also a child, right? So Mary went to a Baptist church, and her pastor actually said this. This one old Negro because it was pretty, like, the evidence was stacked against actually Newt Lee, who was one of the or sorry, Jim Conley, who was who was the security guard and was black. But he said this one old Negro, meaning black person, would be poor atonement or poor payment for the life of this innocent girl. In Leo Frank, though, who was a New York Jewish factory boss, white Protestant Atlantans found a demon worthy to pay for the crime. What they're saying here is that basically, like, it becomes pretty obvious in the trial and stuff that it's not Leo Frank that's guilty, but people are like, look, a black person isn't worth much in our eyes. Like, we still sometimes lynch black people and don't get in trouble or whatever. But if we let this other guy hang for this crime, even if he didn't do it, like, it makes us feel better. Like, her death is like his death is where his death, the Leo Frank, his death would be worth more to us than just some random black guy. Because again, remember, they're very racist. They think very little of black people. So Leo goes to trial. The trial is super unfair. There's a lot of yellow journalism going on, lots of newspapers, a lot of publicity, and not very accurate. The courtroom was kind of out of control. There was lots of loud and opinionated people yelling and saying what they thought. When the jury, the people who are going to decide if he's guilty or not, when they would go into the courtroom and out of the courtroom, like for lunch breaks and stuff, the people would scream at them, hang the Jew or we'll hang you. So basically, right, saying, you better find him guilty or else, like, we're going to get after you. So, I mean, there's definitely a lot of pressure for the jury to just make sure that they vote guilty for Leo Frank. Not surprisingly, then, Leo Frank is found guilty and sentenced to hang. But he isn't like sentenced to hang immediately. He's supposed to go to jail for a while until he actually faces hanging. So Jim Conley's lawyer, so Jim Conley, remember, was the security guard that was black, that they said, yeah, he might be guilty, but he's not worthy to pay for the crime. So Jim Conley's lawyer later on comes out and says, look, Leo Frank is not guilty. He is innocent because my client, Jim, has confessed to the crime. Like, he told me himself he's the one who killed this girl. And so Jim Conley's lawyer comes out and tells the public this because he wants Leo Frank not to die. He's like, he shouldn't hang for this crime that he didn't do. And so many people, after this lawyer comes out and says this, many people try to push the governor of Georgia to basically commute or pardon Leo Frank. What this means is that they're going, if like the governor commuted or pardoned him, it means he forgives him of the crime, because ultimately, we know Leo Frank isn't actually guilty. Many of people, though, on the opposing side said, who cares? Like, Leo Frank, we still believe he's guilty and we still want him to hang. So basically, the governor is facing a lot of pressure from both sides and it's hard for him to decide what to do. Ultimately, he does do the right thing and he tries to protect Leo. So he knows that if he just says, like, yeah, I commit you of this crime, Leo, and you're, like, free to go, like, he knows that Leo would be unsafe just suddenly walking out of a prison. So until things try to, kind of blow over, the governor actually secretly sends him to a prison far away to protect him. But the Knights of Mary Fagan, as they become known, which it's literally just the KKK, they find out somehow, I can't remember how, but they find out what prison he goes to. They break into the prison, they kill the security guard, and then they take Leo out of his prison cell and drive him away and they hang him. Even though later on, Leo even says, he talks to them, and basically a lot of these men that you see in this picture here, they are convinced that he's not guilty, but that at this point, they're like, well, it's too late now, we're going to hang you anyway. And so here you can see this is an actual picture of the men who hung him. Now, the question is why? Like, why did the death of Mary Fagan lead to an increase in the KKK? Well, it's because a lot of people in the South, remember, especially like poor white people, they felt like their way of life in rural America and their beliefs and stuff, they were being forgotten, and that basically the society of like urban flappers and stuff like that, that's what was kind of taking hold all over the US, and they were afraid of that. And so they wanted kind of revenge for stuff that they felt was unfair. And the KKK, the Knights of Mary Fagan, they're going to protect their old way of life. And so because of this death, it gives basically people that maybe would have ended up being part of the KKK anyway, it gives them an excuse basically to like rise up. So again, the two events that kind of lead to the rise of the KKK during the 1920s is the death of Mary Fagan, and then those Ku Klux Klan members basically hanging Leo, and that book and movie, The Birth of a Nation. Now, who were members of this new Ku Klux Klan? They're mostly going to be white, Anglo-Saxon and Celtics. That basically means white. It's like people from the United Kingdom area. In general, they're not going to be, they are religious. They're going to be like Methodists or Baptists, like some form of Protestant faith. But there were some non-churchgoers as well. These people, though, supported fundamentalism. That means like the literal interpretation of the Bible. So like if it says God created the world in 7 days, he really did it in 7 days. Most of these would be native-born Americans, meaning they're not immigrants. So at some point in their ancestry, right, their parents or grandparents or whatever were immigrants, but these people were born in the U.S. Remember, I said the Klan is not just in the South like the first Ku Klux Klan was. This Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s is kind of all over the U.S. in northern and southern states. A lot of them were from like poor social classes, like white poor people, but in rural areas. But it was also, I mean, rich as well. Now, they're not just hating and pushing back against black people. They're not just prejudiced and racist towards them. They're also really against alcohol and bootleggers, Catholic people, Jews, communists, immigrants, and again, like I said, also African Americans. Local like Ku Klux Klan groups would decide which groups they were going to target. But again, it's more than just black people. There's a lot of people that they are going to be pushing and terrorizing against during the 1920s. Now, some of the violence that the KKK would do against others were they would whip people sometimes. They would tar and feather them. That means where you dip them in hot tar and then throw chicken feathers on them. So it burns you really bad. I mean, it doesn't always kill you, but it burns you really bad, and then you're stuck with feathers on you, and it's a disaster. Other things they might do was use acid to brand the letters KKK into your forehead if you were like African American, Jew, or some other group that they considered like anti-American. Lots of times, ministers, sheriffs, other policemen, mayors, judges would ignore the violence or even participate. So there's not a lot of backlash during the 1920s. And few Klansmen were arrested, much less actually convicted of crimes. So if you're already pretty racist or feel like you're going to be violent against some group that for whatever reason you hate, and there's going to be little chance of you getting in trouble for it, then you're going to go for it. And so because the police weren't doing their job, because other high-ups in society weren't doing their job to stop this, it also continued to rise into power. Now, something different about the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s is that, yeah, they were still doing some of the stuff that the Klan of the like 1860s and 70s did, but they also become really powerful in politics. So there was members of the KKK that served in state Congress. Like that means like our state in St. Paul, they have like we have state senators and state House of Representative members, like just for the state of Minnesota. And then we also have Congress members that we send to Washington, D.C. So what this is saying is that there was members of the KKK at the state level and at the national level, and there were some governors in several states that identified as KKK members. Places like Indiana, Oklahoma, Texas, and Oregon saw a lot of Klan influence. Again, you look, some of those states are not in the South. During the 1920s, at the height of their power, there were between 4 and 5 million Klans members. So again, it gained a lot of popularity during the 1920s. They were even, you can see here, they were the Klan members, they're totally openly saying, I'm a Klan member, and they were marching in Washington, D.C. Okay, so there's very little pushback against this group to say, like, what the heck are you guys doing? Now, thankfully, also in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan starts to reduce in power. There's a couple reasons for this. One is that the American Unity League began to reveal the names of some of the Klan's members and like what they were doing. And then some of these members actually had to go to trial. There was also a major power struggle between like who was going to be the leader. I think it called like Grand Wizard or something, or is the leader. And there was the group basically split because there was a power struggle for who was going to lead. Some state laws forbade the use of masks, and so it eliminated some of the secret element, which, I mean, obviously some people, like you saw in the last picture, some people are not being, they're showing their face here, but they're also not committing an illegal crime like killing someone in front of everyone. Versus, if they're going to do something very obviously illegal, like, tar and feather someone, they wanted to be blindfolded so you didn't know. And the last one was that the head of the Indiana Klan, which is the guy pictured here, he was found guilty of crimes, and then he went to prison. So that kind of fizzled out the Indiana Klan. So by 1930, there were less than 30,000 members. So thankfully, even though it quickly gained popularity, it also lost popularity quickly. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about for the 1920s is the Palmer raids. So there's a 3-minute video, so I want you to go watch the video and do your best to understand what it's saying. So you can push pause on this video and watch the 3-minute video. There's a link on Schoology under this same assignment area. And then when you're done, you can come back and I'll kind of overview some of the video. Okay, hopefully by now you have watched the video. So to kind of reiterate some of what the video said. So communism was something that was gaining popularity in Eastern Europe and in Russia during this time. And communism is kind of the opposite of the US in many ways because we have capitalism. Now, capitalism says if I have an idea for some new business, I can go, let's say my business is I want to go create a bakery in Deer River, Minnesota. I have that chance that I can create a bakery and it's my own private business and I own it. The government doesn't own it. No one else owns it. I own it and I make money off it. Communism says we as a whole country, we all share everything and no one owns that. It's all owned by us. There's no private ownership. So to Americans who are rich like Henry Ford or John D. Rockefeller, right? The idea that they could lose their businesses if like the US becomes communist, it was very they were very afraid of that happening because it happened in Russia just, a couple years before, because 1917 is when Russia becomes communist. So Americans were kind of afraid of Eastern European immigrants coming into the US. Whether they identified as communist or not, a lot of Americans were prejudiced and racist against people coming from Eastern Europe or Russia because they were afraid that they were communists or anarchists. Anarchists are people that are just say we shouldn't have a government in place. We don't need a government in place, and just kind of overthrow the established order. And so they believe that they would, end this capitalistic private ownership way of life in the U.S. And so a lot of Americans are afraid of this, and this is what leads to these Palmer raids. The Palmer raids were an attempt by actually the U.S. government, kind of because of the heightened paranoia of all the people in the U.S. It was an attempt to arrest and deport anyone that was an anarchist or a communist. Now, most of the people that were deported, honestly, probably were neither of those things, but it was kind of this like paranoia and hysteria in the whole U.S. that forced these Palmer raids. Now, this time period in the 1920s when these Palmer raids happened became known as this Red Scare. Okay, because red is like a slang word for communists, partly because Russia is like a red flag. And so basically, Red Scare just means a scare or fear of communists in the US. And there was a lot of paranoia and fear of communist people or red people in the US during this time, hence why the Palmer raids happened. The Palmer raids, there wasn't a ton of backing behind it, but it happened because of this because of this Red Scare. Now, if you listen to the video, they were talking about Sacco and Vanzetti, and basically they were known anarchists, so they were for like overthrowing a government, but they were like accused of a crime that they probably honestly didn't commit. So it was unfair. But it should remind you of some other unfair trial you just learned about. So if you don't know the answer to that, wow, you got to go back to the beginning of this PowerPoint and learn more. because I'm not going to completely answer this last question for you. It should remind you of something else we've talked about in this PowerPoint. All right, if you guys need help, obviously you know that there's various options. You can call me, email me, text me through Remind, join me on WebEx for video chats 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Just get a hold of me if you need help, okay? All right, good luck, and make sure you submit that into Schoology when you are done.